Hey guys, this is Miss Vinion. Sorry about my man voice. We're still covering the Roaring Twenties, and so today we're going to cover the characteristics and key figures of the Harlem Renaissance and describe the changing status of women in socially and economically. We are going to cut this learning target, and we're also going to talk about Tennessee a little bit, but we're going to have to cut some of the learning targets for time. So let's go ahead and get started. So 1920s, we've already covered this a little bit. Things were changing for women. The symbolic new woman of the 1920s, they're called flappers, and those are after the galoshes that they wore, which are sort of like rain boots. And this was influenced by movie actresses as well as their own desires for independence. And young women shocked their elders by wearing these new dresses before they went down to their ankles, and now they came up to their knees to show off their calf. And women started smoking cigarettes and driving cars, and they were frequently featured in 1920s literature, such as in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, which we've already talked about in class. Okay, so this leads to a rise of feminism in the 1920s, and more women are working outside the home. And they are more high school and college graduate women. They're taking office jobs. Now, when it says they work outside the home, they only really work outside the home until they got married, and then they had to go, then it was expected that they would go back into the house. They also sought to gain voting rights at this time, and they also fought for an equal rights amendment. So that leads us to the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment, as we know, was ratified in 1920. The 36th state, Tennessee, ratified it, and that was Harry Byrne. And this guarantees the right to vote regardless of gender. So this is pretty cool because women now have a say. But a little fact is that in 1920, women didn't vote basically on what they thought, but they kind of adopted the preferences of the men in their party. Men in their family. So, for example, if their husbands voted Republican, then they voted Republican. Or if their brothers voted Democrat, then they voted Democrat. Because they were new to it, so they weren't really, not a lot of them took a stand on it. Okay, so other things that are changing are birth rate declines, and marriages are more based on love. And you'll find it interesting that after women's suffrage, state lawmakers started listening to women more, yay women, and the women started demanding changes for divorce laws. That way women could escape abusive and incompatible husbands, which really is what the marriage was focused on, more on love at that time. Before 1930, there was 1 in 6 marriages ended in divorce, which before that there was 1 in 8. So you can tell already that there's more, there's a higher divorce rate. Now it's 1 in 2, so obviously it's much higher now. But the other thing is cool is that new child labor laws allow children to stay in school. So by the end of the 1920s, the number of high school graduates had doubled to over 25% of the school-age young adults. So that's pretty cool. And the other thing over here, this is Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger is, she really promoted birth control, and so not a lot of women used it, and it was pretty much like illegal in most states. So it's still against the law, but this birth control encouraged greater promiscuity. So this kind of goes with the jazz age and roaring 20s and people, kind of having premarital sex and not really worrying about it. But Margaret Sanger, the organization she started will later lead to the creation of Planned Parenthood. So go Margaret Sanger, because that's awesome. Okay, so that leads us to things that are, things are changing for African Americans. And we've already talked about the Great Migration, but we want to talk about this idea of the new Negro. So if we use that word today, Negro, that's not a word that people use. So we have to remember the words that are used back then are what were acceptable at the time. So many blacks moved to northern cities for better opportunities in the Great Migration, and they tended to live together. So ghettos, remember, are ethnic neighborhoods. But many saw just as much discrimination in the North, okay? And this guy, Elaine Locke, described the changes in attitudes and beliefs of African Americans, and how interesting it is that they moved north for freedom and for less discrimination and came upon more discrimination. These are the two African American intellectuals that talk about equality at the time, and we've already covered these two. I just wanted to refresh your brain: Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And the common question is, what should African Americans do to get their place in society? Because Civil War is well over, and we're still in Jim Crow laws, so what do African Americans do about their place in society? So if you'll remember, Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and you have a Venn diagram on this, so this would be a good time to look at this because it'll be on your test. He was educated at Hampton University, and he's the founder of Tuskegee University. Okay, and his plan was that blacks do not need to blame whites for their situation, that if they want to be seen as equal, they have to work their way up and be seen as equal. So build an economic base with farming and industry. And he said, you should accept Jim Crow. We should work for the economic opportunity, not fight for it at this point. And having civil and political rights were not as important as having economic opportunity. And he also believed in developing programs for job training and vocational skills, and that would educate people and get them to a more equal platform with whites. And remember, Booker T. Washington talked to a lot of white people. A lot of the people he spoke to were white. And he even dined with President Roosevelt, TR, in 1901. Okay? So the other guy is W.E.B. Du Bois. And remember, he was born a free black. He's educated at Fisk and Harvard University, so college degree. Initially supported Booker T. Washington, but then he kind of pans off on his own path. So basically, he's saying the problem of the 20th century is the line of color. And if you think about it, that's still a problem. Not just with blacks and whites, but just all across the board. So he demanded immediate equality, that blacks should not accept what they've been given, and they should fight for it. Yes, of course they should get educated. And then he advocated for what we call the talented 10. That if there's a certain group of African Americans that became doctors, lawyers, and intellectuals, that they would be more accepted. He also created the NAACP, and his goal in this was to secure for all people the rights guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So we remember end of slavery, citizenship, and all men to vote. Okay, so the first president of the NAACP was actually a white lawyer, and the NAACP is it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that's going to go all the way up into the 60s and be highly influential in the civil rights movement. All right, so I like this. Who would have said it? I want you to think about it because we're going to go over it in class. Demand equality and demand it now. Who said it? Be a plumber, be an electrician, get a job, and earn the respect of the white man. Who would have said it? We are just as smart as any white person, if not smarter. We shouldn't need to prove that. Demand that Jim Crow laws be repealed throughout the South now. Who would have said it? Okay, so that also brings us to another African American who was really pushing standards at the time, and his name is Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Marcus believes in a little bit differently than the other guys. He believed that blacks should be separate, that whites and blacks will never be able to live together. And so his great idea was to send African Americans back to Africa, and it's called the Black Star Line. So he basically established this organization so that African Americans could be self-sufficient. However, he was charged later on federal charges of fraud for this Black Star steamship, and not a lot of people got on the boat, if you know what I mean. They just didn't get on with the idea that they should go back to Africa because their ancestors had been living in America for hundreds of years. Some hundreds of years. So why would they go back to a country they knew nothing about? So his movement kind of collapsed, and it really then just focused on W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Now, jazz. Okay, so all of these things, are changes for African Americans, but also really great changes for America. It was originated in New Orleans, and they say this is like the only true American music because it came from America. And it was played a lot in speakeasies. So a lot of times people put the feeling of drinking alcohol in speakeasies and jazz. So if you have alcohol and jazz together, then people saw that as corrupting youth. It's like the rock and roll of the 1920s. And this is Louis Armstrong. I'm going to play you some music in our next class so you can listen. Or just get on your Spotify or Pandora and look up Louis Armstrong. This is not Harlem Renaissance. This slide is out of order, but we're going to cover it. Don't forget that we talked about how literature is changing in the 1920s, and a lot of these authors are disillusioned by World War I. So they call them the Lost Generation, and they write books about World War I or about the time period after World War I. The two most important ones are Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Ernest Hemingway wrote Farewell to Arms, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, we read in class, he wrote The Great Gatsby. Okay, for the Harlem Renaissance, This is Langston Hughes, and you've probably heard of him, like famous author and poet. So this is basically a part of New York that is a flourishing of African American musical, literary, and artistic talent, and it's centered in New York City. The one thing you really need to understand about Harlem Renaissance is that it changes many Americans' perceptions of blacks, and it makes them see them as equals because of the art and music and just ideas that they produce. It makes other people see that they're real people and they're equals to them. So it was a really important step in the African American movement to equal rights. So if you look, all right, Harlem is right there. It's a neighborhood in New York City, and it's the center of this movement. Okay, so if you look, here it is right here, and you can kind of see like the names are like Frederick Douglass Boulevard and Marcus Garvey Park, okay, FDR Drive. So what I wanted to show you that in 1911 is basically where this started, right here in the dark. 1911 is where Harlem started. And then by 1920, this is how much it expanded. And then by 1930, it has really, really expanded. And even by now, it's a huge part of New York. Okay, so you can see that Black Harlem grew very quickly. So in the 1930s, here's what Harlem looks like. Okay, it's just the center of activity for African Americans, and it's really cool. So what are some causes? Causes we already covered is the Great Migration, African Americans moving for jobs to the north, and moving from more rural areas to urban areas. Every family member has that one member they don't want to admit. That's funny. Don't let it be you. Okay, what push factors led to the migration? Don't forget, push factors were jobs, and push factors were discrimination in the South, and pull factors were jobs. And another thing that it causes them to move is the growing African American middle class. And this is developed because African Americans are now becoming educated and employed, and they're seen as equals. Okay, now it's still 20s. We still have Jim Crow laws in the South, and there's still a lot of discrimination, but this is a really important step for African Americans. Okay, and then also the political agenda, which we've already talked about, W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and the NAACP all help this, racial pride. Okay. So, some other causes is that they call it the Red Summer of 1919. We already talked about the re-emergence of the KKK, and this is where the beginning of lynchings are going to start. So there's 25 major race riots, and at least 83 African Americans were lynched. We're going to watch a video in class that talks about the beginning of one of those race riots, and it's going to blow your mind a little bit, okay? So what's the impact of the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem section of New York City is transformed from a deteriorating area into a thriving middle class. So you can see before and after what Harlem looks like. And you can see it just looks more upper class and just looks nicer. The other thing is blacks view surge in art, music, and literature as the creation of a new cultural identity. Okay, they finally have a voice that's being heard. And white people like seeing it and they like hearing it. And so this is the beginning of merging the cultures together. All right, so jazz also is going to be really important, that shapes American culture. And so we have Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith. All right, I'm going to go through these so we can finish. Okay, so lastly, the election 1928, Coolidge decides, hey, not going to run. And the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover, who was at that time working for Calvin Coolidge, if you remember. And then you have this other guy, Al Smith, who many were suspicious of him because he was Catholic. So Hoover wins by a landslide. He wins by one of the biggest electoral votes ever. I want you to remember that because that's going to be surprising later. And then this is the last slide. Yay, we did it. Okay, when the 20s end, these are all the problems. So we've talked about all of the awesome stuff that's happened, like the reemergence of like the African American middle class. And we've talked about women getting rights. And we've talked about like roles being defined. And we've talked about people believing new things. But these are all the problems. There's a decline in agriculture. No one's been paying attention to the farmers while the industry's been growing. There's high tariffs, and we're not able to import and export very easily. There's rich people and there's poor people, and there's less rich people than poor people. People are making too much stuff. This mass consumption is killing us. They've made too much stuff and no one's buying it. Overuse of credit, people are just going to stores and just buying stuff and not paying for it. And then over speculation in real estate and stocks. So make sure you have all of these in mind as we go into next semester for the Great Depression. Okay, love you guys. Bye.